welcome to the Critical Conversation webinar series. My name is Alyshea Cummins and I'll be the moderator for today's conversation. On behalf of ITREB USA and ITREB Canada, we thank you for joining us today for this week's critical conversation on connecting the spirit through architecture. We are living in unprecedented times. Many of us are feeling isolated and disconnected from our community and faith practices. As we navigate through this experience, we hope that mediums such as this one are able to provide you with a sense of community and support. It is our hope that the conversation that we have today will inspire new ways of thinking about architecture, spirit, and design. A couple of logistical items before we get started. You'll see a chat box available to share questions or thoughts as you see fit. We promise to address as many questions as we can during today's talk, but please accept our sincerest regrets if we are unable to ask your question due to time restraints. We're fortunate to explore today's topic, connecting to the spirit through architecture, with two experts, architects Zamila Karimi and Farouk Noormohamed, as they share their own experience and knowledge to take us through this conversation. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Zamila and Farouk. Thank you both for being with us today. Zamila Karimi is a lecturer at the College of Architecture and Construction Management at Kennesaw State University. She holds a post-professional MArch degree in Cultural Mediations and Technology from McGill University, MFA, the terminal degree in Interior Design from UGA, and BArch from SciArc. Her work explores the intersection between art, architecture, and design to transform ways in which we engage with one another to inspire dialogue across culture, ethnic, and geographic boundaries in contemporary public space. She uses her interdisciplinary background to question the contemporary public space as sites of action, possibilities, and promises through issues pertaining to spatial and social justice. She believes in the power of design to build bridges amongst diverse communities and the role of architects and designers as social agents of change to question the norm, whether through placemaking strategies or addressing challenges around shelter, such as homelessness. Her numerous temporary interactive installations within the public space and community organizations, both nationally and internationally, are used to disseminate her research. Within the community, Zamila has developed the Ethics in Action Aga Khan Development Network, a Diamond Jubilee exhibition, and the New Dimensions, Exploring AKDN Through Arts and Culture. Our next speaker, Farouk Noormohamed, uses architecture to change lives, inspire the spirit, advance sustainability, and promote innovation. His buildings combine breathtaking design, efficiency of space, and harmony with nature. Many of the buildings Farouk has designed have become landmarks in their context, regardless of whether they are private residences, hotels, hospitals, schools, or places of worship. He has designed landmark Imamate projects around the world, from the Ismaili Center in Dushanbe and the Jamaat Khana and Center in Karog, to the Aga Khan Academy in Mombasa and the Aga Khan University in Karachi and the Heart and Cancer Center in Nairobi. He's also designed 17 Jamaat Khanas across the USA, Canada, and around the world. Farouk is passionate about designing buildings that embrace innovation, sustainability, local conditions, and vernacular to reflect the aspirations of their users. Farouk was named a Fellow of the Royal Architecture Institute of Canada, conferred to architects who have made an exceptional contribution to the field of architecture. Passionate about community service, Farouk has done an extensive amount of voluntary and pro bono work, both in designing buildings and working with students and community organizations alike. He is a winner of the AIBC's Barbara Dalrymple Award for Community Service, the International Union of Architects Gold Medal Award for Architecture, International Design Silver Award and winner of the German Design Award, and many other national and international awards and competitions for projects ranging from Jamaat Khanas to hotels, residences, and medical projects. Again, on behalf of ITREB USA and ITREB Canada, we welcome both of you to the Critical Conversation series today. Zamila, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you so much, Alyshea, and thank you for inviting both me and Farouk to this amazing afternoon of virtual space and virtual dialogue. Just as a precursor, I just want to put it out there that both Farouk and I deal with space and sort of tactical feelings with one another and with our audiences. So it's kind of difficult to share ideas about space and materials and materiality and matter through a virtual space, but we will do our best to sort of convey some of the ideas, some of the concepts. So I'm just going to take a second to share my screen. All right, so here we go. So connecting the spirit through architecture, critical conversations webinar. And so, like I said, it's a critical time for us not to be interacting the way we have been used to in our spaces of work, in our spaces of homes, our spaces of Jamaat Khanas, you know, where we are so used to connecting with one another, with the people around us, and as almost like a living tradition. And here now we are sitting at a time when all of that social distancing and staying at home is really challenging the notion of space. But we are a very resilient, you know, social community as humanity, and we have all hope that in no time, you know, human beings will figure out how to kind of move around this and come up with some alternatives. So with that as a backdrop, where space is at a premium, but at a premium virtually and not physically, we are going to start this conversation. So I thought that perhaps I could start showing, you know, how our cities, our places of work, our places of exchange of institutions, all of that is really guided by the notion of materials. You know, all of that is guided by us as human being, as a human body, with all our senses, to create an environment around us, you know, that sort of frames our lives. So all these photographs that you see, images are all around the world. We as Ismaili Muslims, you know, living in the West, whether it's North America, Europe, we are still very much connected to our faith, to our ethics, to our values. But not to say that we do not connect with the ideas around us. And so when we as human beings, as Ismaili Muslim living in the North American tradition, move around New York, Paris, London, you know, moving through our public spaces, or, you know, participating in our social norms, we are always guided by the notion of architecture, the notion of the built environment around us. So if you just look at the view on top of the rooftop, there is a wedding that is going on a rooftop. So within that conversations of humanity and the built environment, architects are sort of, you know, the masters of carving out spaces, forms, ideas, notions, you know, in which this drama of human life can take place. Architecture then really becomes like a receptacle almost where life unfolds. And is architecture Islamic? Is architecture, you know, Byzantine? Is architecture universal? All of those are questions and ideas one can talk about and debate. But at the end of the day, it is the human body with all of its senses, with all of its aspirations, with all of its dreams, imaginations. You know, that's how we create our societies. And it works at multiple scales all around the world. And you can see some examples of how architects have framed, you know, sort of the experience of space, how architects have used materials to create space within another space to create some sort of ideas or beliefs. So the canopy that you see is from New Dimensions at the Jubilee Games in Dubai. And what you see, the framing of you know, the archway is in Seville, Spain. And then you have many other examples on the bottom row where it is from Lahore, where people at the um, the the Mughal gardens, who are working on restoration projects, are appropriating space in the afternoon to sort of create a space for themselves to have a meal. And it was so interesting, this is an AKTC project, a restoration project in Lahore, where people are coming together, they cook there, but they eat together as a community, as a family. You see that, within the niche, which is a mihrab in Fatimid, Cairo, if you will, there's a person laying down, and the image on the right is the image of the Al-Hakim Mosque. So all of these architectural elements that you see people appropriate for themselves to suit their purposes. And I thought this would be a really interesting way for us to then connect as Ismaili Muslims, what do architecture do for us, right? And so this was just last summer that I was in Mumbai, and we were, we visited Aga Hassan Ali Shah's mausoleum in Hasnabad. And, the idea that an Imam, Aga Khan I, moving from Persia into India during his lifetime, thought about creating a mausoleum, almost like an announcement to the population around, whether they were Hindus, Muslims, or whoever. It was British India at that time, that here is a community who has come here to India to stay and to be part of the civil society, if you will. Now, interestingly, if I just went there last summer, and I could see how architecture was appropriated again. So people come in at all times of the day. It's almost like a refuge. And they're using coconut here for some sort of, belief that they have that will, and so here you have a lady who brings like a basket of coconut, and this gentleman is helping him put it on the steps 2 at a time. And so you see within the lines of the steps itself, you have another line that's forming with another color. So an architect would be really interested to see how space is appropriated to suit the needs, the times of the society. And then you see architecture being again appropriated, putting a piece of broomstick, within the 2 columns, and so on. So I'm not going to go into every one, but the idea that architecture is a living tradition, where the building itself was designed upon the Persian tradition, which is a squarish, footprint with the domes on it, and then they have a walkway, the balconies around, which is sort of raised up. So I'm sure Farouk will get into all of that, but I'm just trying to show that architecture really connects to our inner being, our inner self. Now, do we call that spirituality? Do we call it, tradition? Is it cultural? I mean, all those are questions that I think one sort of gets into and begins to explore through their own experiences. So here we have architecture is really a human story. It is about people, it is about places, it is about spaces, if you will, just as a layering of ideas, layering of the way we kind of work in our day-to-day life. And so within that, then, one questions, does architecture really inspire the spirit? If it does, how does it do that? What are its tactics? What is materiality in all of this, And here I have 3 distinct images. One is, from Spain to Pakistan, Karachi, where this whole notion of light was brought into the space using local vernacular materials, which was kind of lost before, we were just copying what was architecture from the West. And then the image on the right is really Alive for Alyson, a great installation artist. He has put this installation in the Louis Vuitton Foundation building in Paris, where it is the mirror, through, again, the mirror is segmented through the lines of the columns. And as you go through it, there's a visual perception, deception, and you come one-to-one with your own image and you start to question as to what really is architecture, And so here I just also want to share some of the ideas of how art and architecture relates, and how does an artist work in that interdisciplinary space that we have. So space is really at the premium, like I say, but space can also be used to bring issues of our times, questions as an artist. And this was an installation called Encounters, exploring sort of identities through the notion of courtyard. And here I'm using ice as a material, again, doing this same geometrical, pattern that we used at the Atlanta Jamaat-Khana, and that's been repeated, but it's also been used in a way that material starts to play into the architecture. And then this whole idea of the 5 elements that connect us as human beings. I'm not going to go into it too much, but the idea that, we can adopt the tradition, we can learn from it, but we don't have to sort of, just adopt it blindly. We can be critical with those things. And so, we see that we as Ismaili Muslims living in the West or the East, as global citizens, I should say, are always, are coming one-to-one with the built environment. Our senses are sensitized to the built environment because of the work of our imam in the field of architecture, right? My own career started along the time when Hazrat Imam started the Aga Khan Award for Architecture. And so the institutions that we have within our community, the imam's guidance, as Ismaili Muslims, of course, is an undertone within which all of us sort of move and feel his presence and his guidance. And so at the last award in Tajikistan, Hazrat Imam, made the speech and asked the question. So everybody asked me, just why should the Ismaili Imam become so involved with the world of professional architecture? And then he goes on to say, the simple answer lies in my conviction that architecture, more than any other art form, has a profound impact on the quality of life. As it has often been said, we shape our built environment and our buildings shape us, right? And I mean, there's so much to unpack in this, and I thought this could be a really great way. It was just last year in September, I believe, and it's not even been a year, and who knew this COVID would keep us all so far away, but yet we would be connected virtually, which I'm really grateful for, as to share some of these questions. We don't have the answers, as architects. We are all sort of guided by our faith. We look at the environment, we ask questions, we observe, we look at the phenomena of nature, and our human condition to then help us understand, how can we as architects become social agents of change to really bring this community together. Then Hazrat Imam goes on to say, how can architecture blend different perspectives? I mean, that's a big mandate if on all of us, and I would bring in artists, architects, scientists into this conversation. And here he lays out 4, key ideas, and I'm not going to go deep into it, but you can read his speech. It is on AKDN website. But for the first, he's talking about how can architecture become a collaborative process between clients, between architects, between every other, I guess, constituency that is impacted by it. How can architecture not forget its history, its culture, and sort of bridge that gap? Can architecture think about the idea of sustainability that is, I believe, is the cause of what we are going through now? We are not really, and we are not creating a sustainable society that we are acting as responsible for the diverse life that is out there, right? And then the last and the most important is how can architecture, help and become a catalyst for intercultural dialogue. And this is where pluralism, diversity, this is where all of these ideas, questions come into being. So then we go on to ask, okay, Imam is saying that architecture brings us together. Imam is talking about historical sort of connotations of how can history move us forward, and pluralism and diversity and sustainability and all of that. So here we sort of come to the question, so who are we as Ismaili Muslims? What is our faith? How is our faith guiding us into all of this? Do we really think about the built environment in that sense? And so first and foremost, as any Muslim, we are a responsible human being with an intellect, right? And our responsibilities are to one another. Our responsibilities are to the society we live in. Our responsibilities is to our environment. But in all of this, the only supreme being that each one of us individually is guided by is our relationship to He who is above all, right? And so in that sense, when we pray, we just submit to the will of Allah. And in that submission, there is a unity where we believe there is one God, but His His world, the God's world has got multiple forms. There's a lot of multiplicity. So this idea, I'm not theologist in any way, but the idea of one and many, is a very interesting idea that architects are always dealing with. And so the concepts, the key words on the bottom is sort of what then starts to create some sort of an imagery of what this Islamic architecture or the idea could be. So we don't believe in figurative art. So the idea of geometry, mathematics, calligraphy, the idea of the heaven, that has been talked about in the Quran, the life year after, the charbagh, the courtyard, the light, the changing phenomena, all of these becomes our tools and tactics through which we then create architecture. And I'm sure Farouk will go more into it. So then, it was in 1979, this was almost around the time when Hazrat Imam created the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, that he was invited to speak at the Asia Society. And in this speech, he really laid out sort of a mandate for what can Islamic architecture be. This is also the time when he, was developing, building Aga Khan University. There were a whole group of Western architects who were sort of mandated to go visit all the Islamic sites, with historians, and an amazing program which sort of catapulted Islamic architecture into a contemporary spirit, because we really don't want to be frozen in time. Architecture is a living tradition. We are living, breathing human beings who are always evolving. And so Hazrat Imam then talks about, like, there's no dichotomy between spirituality and physical living, right? And we all know about it. He talks about the concept of the idea of that we have to submit to the will of Allah. And in that sense, we are not becoming, confined in any way, but we need to find solutions that is going to help create a better environment for all, right? And then he talks about that, how our faith sort of resonates on the buildings that we build, the spaces where we live, where we move. And that sort of reverberates on our spirit, and so again, the notion of spirit comes in. These are just two sort of images of monuments, that we all go as tourists, we visit. So this is Taj Mahal on the left and Alhambra. And the idea of framing, the idea of dematerialization, the idea of light, keep these sort of concepts in mind, because as we look at Farouk's projects, we'll begin to see how can a contemporary space be created using these sorts of ideas, which is like 1400 years old. And this is where Hazrat again gives us the responsibility that we are vicegerent of God on earth. And there is a trust that has been entrusted on us. So we cannot take this lightly. So we go to then the Islamic architecture, which is the Prophet's mosque, which was very humble, in less than, 150 years, we were building mosques like Cordoba, and where there was real fusion of cultures. We, as Muslims, were always, very, very sort of forthcoming. We were a pluralistic community. We engaged with the other peoples of the other faiths. And so we were influenced by Greco-Roman influences on the West, and then the Persian Indian influence on the East. And here are some examples of that. And so you see the two kinds of architecture that began to evolve or generate is totally different styles, but again, it speaks to one God. Keep in mind this Bukhara, Uzbekistan, because you will have like a nice sort of a correlation between that and what Farouk will talk about. The idea of space, with using earthly materials, the idea of geometry, all of that begins to emerge in the Islamic architecture. And so now we see this fusion of cultures, built form, all of this taking shape, manifesting itself at the great mosque of Damascus, right? And you see mosaics, but the mosaics are done by artists and artisans from the Byzantine influence, right? And so there is a real flourishing of cultures, ideas, and all of that. So now we come to what is architecture, right? And I go back to Vitruvius, 5th century BC, and he is talking about that a building should have formitas, utilitas, and venustas, which means that the ideal building should stand up, with gravity and take form and shape. He talks about function. He talks about an ideal building, an ideal piece of architecture should be so easy to move around, right? So functionally, it should satisfy the needs of the program, right? And then in the end, in doing these two, you cannot just build a box. You need to think about, how is it going to bring in light, And so this whole idea of senses that I'm talking about begins to emerge. And so then the architect's task really is to bring some sort of an order to the needs of the society. And then within that order, within that assemblage, he needs to think about this whole notion of phenomenology and notions of experience of the space, right? And so again, you see, from public space to private space to interior space, how some of these tactics are evolving in both Eastern and Western sort of architecture. So then architect really becomes a choreographer of space, right? So he's got all of these, he's got, of course, the program, which is very functional that the client gives him. But then he is in his mind observing the context where this piece of architecture is going to go, right? Within that context, he's looking at, okay, what sort of form will be appropriate for this space or this piece of land where I'm going to, etch my design, right? What are the sun paths? How can I take advantage of the topography? How can I bring color? And you see that an architect, tries to put his built, formation, manifestation in the way that it satisfies the functions of the space. It becomes an aesthetic experience. It becomes spatial. It is much, much more than what he started with. So he's really creating an assemblage as an artist, as a sculptor. So here we have some examples. Architecture is spatial. It frames people's lives. We experience architecture through our bodies, through our senses. It's kinesthetic in a way. And so you see here are some examples of how architecture at different scales are bringing people together and creating an environment where, I mean, it's very important for us to be always calm and not react and all of these things. So psychological aspects of space makes you behave in a certain way. It improves the quality of your life. Here we see Alhambra, you know, so from the outside, the building is almost like a fortress, and all architecture, in all Islamic architecture always talks about the interiority, right? It is only when you cross that threshold is when the manifestation of the, you know, the power or the beauty of God is revealed. And this is seen through architecture in so many forms. And this is Alhambra. I don't want us to think that only Ismaili sort of talk about it. So I'm just going to quickly run through. So this is a Japanese architect, Tadao Ando, how he's using light to create sacred spaces. It has often been talked about architecture as a frozen music. Music is liquid architecture. Architecture is frozen music. And you see, again, light, you know, sort of all throughout the day changes and changes the mood of the spaces inside. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly sort of end it. So here you see materials, you see how East and West have now come together, time have compressed. And so I'm going to sort of end here by talking about the Atlanta Jamaat Khana, which I had the great fortune to work with Farouk. I was very young, straight out of school, and since then he's been my mentor. And you know, when architecture, when Atlanta Jamaat Khana project came along, and when Farouk came onto board, he gave us a wonderful building. This building had so much spaces that could then became a catapult for our Jamaat to sort of use at different times. So these are some images of how Camp Mosaic really started. And these children that you see now are great, successful individuals in their own right, who are great cellists, you know, who work at the World Bank and all of that. So what I'm going to end is a great building must begin with the unmeasurable, sort of the idea, the concept. It has to go through a measurable means to make it available to build it. And then in the end, the final result is what is unmeasurable that inspires the spirit. So with that, I will give it all to you, Farouk. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Zamila. It was an amazing presentation. I have a lot to live up to now. I'm a practitioner. I have to make sure all these wonderful ideas and background that you've given to the audience can translate into real buildings that can actually work. And one of the things that I'd like to do is, before I go into the presentation, is to thank the Tariqa board for Canada and the US to put this program together. I think architecture has a lot of meaning for people, particularly today in today's lifetime when we are cooped up in our homes. But as we discuss architecture today, let us see if we are able to find those little gems in our own houses, in our own spaces, and can we make them those special little areas where we can actually think about the idea of God and the presence of He who is above all else, whether it is through understanding of what we discussed today, or how we are able to then see them in our own houses, our own homes, because you don't always have to build, but you can bring ideas and then translate those ideas in your own interpretation. So in this presentation, we'll try and give you some language, some understanding, and then you can go out there and apply it to yourselves, understand not only the way you see your own spaces, but you'll also be able to understand how we can use this background information that you will have to look at buildings that are both Muslim and non-Muslim, and see what makes them great, what makes them special. And once we go through this presentation, you'll be able to have an idea of how architects work. So let me just go into my presentation. So here we go.
You can minimize that if you want.
1 second. Okay. The first example that we're actually going to look at is the Lionsgate Jamaat Khana in Vancouver. This is a Jamaat Khana that I did very soon after I completed the Aga Khan University project. And at this time, the same speech that Zamila talked about, the Asia Society speech that Haj Imam made in Pakistan, is a speech that basically really created a framework for me to start my practice. And here I had a project, the Jamaat Khana. And what I wanted to do is to see if we can actually use all of the ideas that Haj Imam had presented in this speech to see how we can actually create a live situation where we can actually understand all the elements of the building that are embodied into a real architecture. So first portion of the speech that I would like to highlight is that Haj Imam talks about Islam does not deal in dichotomies, but all in encompassing unity. Spirit and body are one, man and nature are one. What is more, man is answerable to God for what man created. Now, I'm looking at this from a different angle. If you're actually part of the process creating architecture, then it is your responsibility. So the architect plays a very important role in translating this idea that you're answerable to God. And if you're answerable to God, whatever you do is going to influence the life of people, and you have to be responsible. You have to do it responsibly. Then Haj Imam goes on to say, many of our greatest architectural achievements were designed to reflect the promises of life hereafter, to represent in this world what we are told of the next. Since all that we see and do resonates on the faith, the aesthetics of the environment we build and the quality of social interactions that take place within this environment reverberate on our spiritual lives. These are broad statements that are really powerful and important for us to understand how architecture underpins how our life is molded through architecture. The first project, of course, I'm talking about is the Lionsgate Jamaat Khana. And Zamila in her presentation talks about context. And the context is, in this case, North Vancouver. We are in a native land, and we are basically trying to see, we are going to put in a Muslim building. In fact, it was a tennis club. And how will we translate that into a Muslim building, but yet respecting the culture and the context in which we are located? This is what we were given, a building, which is basically, it was a tennis club. And the idea was that you were going to transform this building to make it respectful for the context and culture in which you're situating, but you're also doing it for a program, which is a Jamaat Khana for the Ismaili community. And then it is sitting in a context where you see it's very strongly set in nature. Now we look at this building and see how it would get transformed. This looks like a lot of squiggles for most people. And I'll just run my cursor through this thing, and you can actually see some of the beginnings of the ideas that are on the building. So when you look at the building as we move along, these are 3 portals that I drew. This is my very first sketch that I actually made of what this project might be. And since it was an ugly tin box, I was dreaming and imagining, could we make this building disappear? How does a big building disappear? Is the question. And the question was that if we actually created a context in which we place it, and if we created things that are interesting in front of it, you could actually forget about the building that was there and then create punctuations in that building that would basically allow us to actually break the scale of that building. So this is what happened. We added a lot of layers on it. And as you can literally see, by lighting the areas that we were actually adding to this building, we made that building disappear. Now, why is this significant? The significance of this building is that we wanted to create our own building that would have our own values in it. And then Imam's speech again comes into play. In Islamic design, the basic forms are balanced and ruled by geometry. There's a sense of stability, tranquility, and equilibrium. And with serenity goes modesty. There's a lack of domination and pride, superiority of man-made structures over natural environment is a concept alien to Islamic belief. So this building then wanted to disappear. It didn't want to dominate the space, so it wants to be part of the context. And it had wanted to have a sense of stability, tranquility, and some geometry that you would be able to see. So we basically created an entrance in front of it where you created a strong sense of geometry and arrival, and basically lost the building in the context within the setting of landscape. Then Imam goes on to describe, there's a strong kinesthetic experience in Islamic building. There's a play upon the physical senses, air currents touching the skin, the sound of moving water, the touch of varied surfaces, surface textures, richness of color, and a play of light and shade upon the vision. The scent of plants in the courtyards are touches of paradise to come. These are all, as Zamila calls it, tools for the architect to actually play with. And in this case, again, what we did was to translate all of those ideas into these forms that you see in the building, the sound of moving water, the play of light and shadow, and the colors and textures in the landscape that you see, reminders of paradise to come. And again, you see more light and shadow. And then Imam talks about, we finally were able to find applications of styles which are expressed in our attitudes and beliefs. There's a framing of space, for instance. We define each area. We construct a physical context for each activity in daily life. There's always a definite delineation between privacy and community, light areas and areas in shadows, small spaces and large spaces, interiors and exteriors. Each is framed and set apart by itself usually with formality. There is a further formality, it might even be called solemnities, in the passageways that connect all of the differing spaces. So you saw those portals that we had, and then you come into these passageways to connect. And as we go through this space, you're able to see the play of light and shadow. If you see in this image, there are 3 shafts of light. Again, what we're doing is not only understanding what Hazrat is talking about, but layering it with our understanding of our faith. So 3 is a reminder of Ali, Allah, and Muhammad. And as the light that you see in the skylight above, you can see it's falling onto that dark granite, which is here that you see. And this granite piece symbolically transforming the human being, the murid's life, when the light of Allah touches his soul. And there is small spaces into large spaces. And finally, as Imam talks about calligraphy, which adorns so much of what we have built, was a constant reminder of the spiritual content through its common design and endless expression of the name of God. And again, coming into the Jamaat Khana, you see the use of calligraphy. It says Allahu Akbar. And in the background, you see the steps that the ceiling is having. And again, if we layer it with meaning, it was intended for us to remember our ultimate goal of becoming one with Allah. So you're talking about understanding the Zahir, the steps through which you will actually attain salvation, understanding of who He is above all else, and you will connect with Allah. And these steps of 5 understandings, Hakikat, Marifat, etc., all the way into Fanafillah. So this was basically an example and a precursor for you to actually now situate all the other projects that I will show you and how these will actually fall in within the overall context of what Haj Imam talked about in his presentation. So the next project we're looking at is the Aga Khan Academy in Mombasa. And it is not a Jamaat Khana. It is not a building that is a place of worship. But if we look at all the concepts that Imam talked about and how we were able to apply them in the project that we looked at the Lionsgate Jamaat Khana, we again look at the whole idea of context, and same kind of thing that Zamila was talking about it in her presentation. So in this case, the project is located in Mombasa. It is a coastal town. And this was an international design competition. So we were actually trying to see how we could actually bring in fresh new light to thinking about how a school should be designed. And we challenged the whole idea that the school had to be a corridor with classrooms on either side, double loaded. And we said that if you are living in Mombasa, and there's a context, and the context is that these are narrow streets, and narrow streets are places where people will walk. If we understand the historical, if people know about the historical town of Lamu, Lamu has no cars in it, and it's a fully pedestrian city, and it conducts business through people coming in on water. So you can see them, people coming in water. And then there is, along the water, there is a promenade. And this promenade essentially is a place where international business from the outside world actually happens. And once you are in the building, and once you are through this, through the buildings that are placed along this promenade, these are the mercantile buildings, the buildings process whatever is happening within them, and then it goes into the bazaars, which are like this, which are really narrow streets, which open up into courtyards, etc. And you see a whole series of interesting design elements that are there, and the doorways where people actually sit. And these are things that are creating a context in which we are going to create this building. So this building that we are going to look at is going to have these elements, and because it is in Mombasa, what we decided is that this school is not going to have any corridors. It's going to have streets where people will walk, and they will have the outside wall will come to the administrative buildings, and then the inside circulation will be for the students and teachers, and they will come into it. We went further and we said that if one were to actually look at and study the local architecture of the area, these are Swahili houses which were comprised of a veranda, a room, and a courtyard, a perfect module for a nursery school classroom. And if you combine these together, then these become a cluster of classrooms, and the student actually grows as the building actually transforms around him. So from a little courtyard house, which would be his classroom or her classroom, and eventually into large buildings. So in this case, you're seeing the completed building. And in this case, we were able to use the local coral from the site when we excavated it and used it as a cladding material. Again, you see how we were able to translate those ideas that were in the buildings that you saw in Lamu, the streets, into real architecture. And again, spaces where students can actually have fun, enjoy the spaces, and again, those ideas of those benches that were there that we saw. And this is an image of the overall campus, and you can again see all of the elements that we talked about are played again in this building, where you have the play of light and shade. You're talking about the context, the series of courtyards reminding us of paradise, and sound of moving water, etc., but looked at it in a fairly different context. So even though this is not a religious building, we want to take away the calligraphy portion of what we saw in the Lionsgate Jamaat Khana. Everything else deals with the human being and how the human being actually feels within the context of architecture. So this was an interesting project we just completed this. The original amphitheater was like this, which is open, and it was so successful that we were asked to look at to see if we can actually use this thing throughout the year. So we were able to put this new canopy in. And again, we were looking at the context in which the building was placed. We didn't want to actually steal away the thinking that went behind it. And again, what we did was to look at the Arab dhows that were actually, that go into the Indian Ocean and go between India, etc. And we used the idea of that sail that was there to actually create the shade for the students. And the way it's designed is that the air can actually pass through these holes, but it's completely sealed from the sun and water, and the water takes its away. So essentially, looking at context and playing with the context to actually provide you with architecture that is appropriate to the context. And this is what it used to be before, and of course now we have a new canopy on it. Now I will take you to Farouk. Now, as Ismail, one of the interesting things is that we constantly are looking at where we practice our faith and where we have our Jamaat Khana, and each one of these experiences that we have when we go to Jamaat Khana is very special. But traditions are different, but the spirit and the faith is consistent. And we were fortunate enough to be asked by Azhar Imam to actually design the Farouk Jamaat Khana. And one of the things that happened was that as many of you may have visited Farouk, but if you haven't, it is a place which is very difficult to get to. The roads are a little better, but not a lot better. And to get there, you have to consistently deal with the situation that the roads may be blocked, there may be avalanches, there may be rock slides, mudslides. But the reason why I'm telling you this story is that when Azhar Imam asked me to go and visit the site and understand the project, I thought that I will be taking a flight from Dushanbe to Farouk, and of course that didn't happen, and we couldn't actually travel by air because the weather was not good, and we drove. It's a 17-18 hour drive. If you're very lucky, you can do it in 14 hours. Excuse me. But you're constantly facing with the idea of, the road may not be available to you, and the drivers are phenomenal, and they will. In those days when I went, they assured me that they have a satellite phone, and I said that what if we get caught in an avalanche? And they said, well, we can phone, but I said there's nobody going to come and get you because you're going to be stuck in the middle of nowhere. So as we drove, the best thing that actually happened was that we didn't actually take the flight. And here I say that faith is a really important part of this, that if this didn't happen and we didn't actually have the good fortune or not so good fortune of flying, we would have never experienced this. So as we were driving through this to Farouk, these beautiful trees, these are called arar trees with a very beautiful white bark, became the one of the things that I started thinking about on this long journey, and how will this building actually be? And I was trying to formulate ideas that will create this new building that we were going to create. So first thing was that as I'm looking at this building, thinking, do you think maybe that these trees could be an interesting part that we could actually use? They're so beautiful, they could become part of the project. And imagining and thinking and dreaming and saying, what if these trees were to become part of this building? And if you see this long vista that is there, what if the entrance of the Jamaat Khana was like this, where you were actually able to see these trees would actually bring you in, and if they would actually march into the building, could be a really interesting and amazing experience. And as we went along the way, we gathered a lot of information. I saw on the mountains, the rocks were basically sliding down, and I was thinking that maybe this could be used as a cladding material. And I saw consistently throughout people were using these rocks to basically to create retaining walls. There was water, and other interesting thing was that finally when we got to Farouk, the Pamiri house, visiting the Pamiri house was a very special experience with the stepped rotating squares and the skylight in the center, reminding you of that search for Allah. But very interesting thing about these houses is that they have 5 columns, and the 5 columns represent the Panchta. So when I finally got to the site, I couldn't believe it. The site was actually in the park right next to the park. The site was right next to the park that Azhar Imam has donated and developed with AKTC in the town of Farouk. And it was full of these lovely arar trees. And here was my dream that, what would it be like to see this Jamaat Khana set into these beautiful trees? And again, it was unfolding as a miracle. And this is the site. You can see that this is where all the arar trees are all around, and it was in the middle of winter, so you don't see too much vegetation, but all of this area is the park. And the park basically is really now fully operational and run by AKTC, and the Jamaat Khana site is in this location. And as I walked along this, the path, the river walk, we saw this pavilion, and it's a chai khana. And the people in Farouk are very used to seeing these things along the pavilion. And the idea that came to mind was that, what if this became a grand pavilion? The Jamaat Khana would become the grand pavilion, and this river walk is right connecting all different parts of the city. Everybody is Ismaili in Farouk, so this would be a wonderful punctuation as the grand pavilion. And we started looking at these as ideas. And this was my very first sketch, imagining what this Jamaat Khana might be with the central portal, and then maybe a Jamaat Khana building on one side, and a portal, the entrance portal along here. And those lovely arar trees, if they come in, and what if they were to march into this building? And of course, the social hall on the other side. And then this was translated when I got back into sketches that were a little more formal. And you can see the art of architecture transforming into something that now needs to be done in a physical sense, to be able to put together through the understanding of materials and the context. And finally, the completed building. So you can see the process of actually internalizing the materials and the context and what the context gives you, and translating it into an architectural form. I'm not going to go through in all the details of what we talked about in the earlier presentation, but I want you to now think about, when you see this portal, what does it remind you of? It reminds you of the centrality of Allah, and basically reminding you that Muhammad is the city of knowledge, and Ali is the gate, and the gate of Ali. And of course, going through this gate, going into these special spaces again, how we were actually able to translate through our sketches, through our ideas, and also learning from the context. In this case, the paving pattern was actually developed from the dresses that the locals actually wear in the area. And then the patterns on the project were found from the hat of this man, and so on. So basically utilizing all the skills. And of course, the locals are very, very good at using the stones, or utilizing the skills that they had, and using the local material, because of the difficulty of getting the material, and then to allow the locals to have local employment. So the project actually becoming a thing that stimulates the local economy. Again, some of the sketches, and then you see the final finished project. These are trees that are still very young, that you see, the landscaping was just put in, but inshallah, over time, you'll start seeing those trees will become tall and will grace the building. And those trees that we were talking about march right into the building, and now hold this beautiful wood roof and bring natural light from it. Essentially, the idea of those tall trees going up and holding up the roof. And this was one of my first sketches that I thought about for the Jamaat Khana, and we were talking about the prayer hall when we discussed the idea of the 5 columns, and how would we actually translate those 5 columns into this building and into this prayer hall, and just a sketch to basically show in the center you see these the stepped ceiling, and then the 5 columns, and of course I wrote here the 5th column, and how would you actually situate it within the 4 columns, which are very, very traditional to Islamic architecture, but the 5th is very special to Ismailis because it reminds us of the Panchtan. And this was a sketch that basically translated that idea. And then this is the finished Jamaat Khana space with the stepped roof, which is like the primary house, and then the 5-column, the 5th one being here, and the calligraphy, which again talks about the Panchta. And this is another sketch of what this building might look like from the other side of the street or other side of the river. And of course, the finished building, you can see, what I'd imagined was this big glass building in the center with the prayer hall on one side and with the social hall on the other, and the mountains at the back. And that's, of course, the mountains are really tall, a lot taller. And the building is very humble in this very gigantic space that is nature. And that's the completed building. Now we go to Dushanbe, and we will basically run through a few slides for the Ismaili Center in Dushanbe. And then what we'll do is that I will share with you a video that we had actually made for a submission for the Mariama Prize. We got shortlisted, but we didn't actually win the prize. But it will actually give you the context in which what Hasimam's aspiration for the building was. And I want you to, again, look at all the elements that we've talked about in the beginning of the presentation, how they translate into this. But one of the things that I want to do is, before I go into this, I want to just share with you some of the sketches that were there. The very first sketch basically showing the 4 components of the building. So the educational, the administration, the social, and the prayer. And this big grand courtyard, the charbagh, basically creating the centerpiece of the courtyard, and the 4 columns and the 5th one in the prayer hall, basically creating this framing. And then the blue that you see is water. So this was really the first idea of how I was actually imagining this building. And of course, you see this translation into this sketch, and the 5 columns with the body of water. And you can see the entry courtyard with the 5 steps, basically understanding of our faith, and you bringing in through this entry portal. And it looks like a lot of squiggles, but you will see how it translates into architecture. So the 5th column is actually here, and this is the prayer hall. And you can see the 4 functional areas around it. And then this was the sketch that was made up to basically translate some of those. And this was our competition submission. It was an international competition that we were fortunate to win. We were invited, and we were fortunate to win this competition. But this was our submission, is what it actually looked like. And now this is the finished building with basically the 5 columns, one in the prayer hall, body of water, and all this thing, and the courtyard that I was telling you with these 5 steps. And there's fountains running in the middle of it. So there you go. That's what you see now as a finished building. And again, walk you through, and this is our sketch, imagining what the space might be. Again, reminder of all the ideas that we discussed, the play of light and shadow, and the use of calligraphy, and again, a sketch and a finished building. And again, you will see the elements of light. And again, a sketch of the courtyard that we imagined. And the reason why I'm showing you this is not because Farouk is a great architect. I'm giving you this because one can actually not have great architecture without inspiration. And if you are inspired to do certain things, the architect has to become humble to basically be a translator of the idea of the will of who is above all that. So in this case, when I'm sketching and translating these ideas, I'm as if in meditation, and the idea of actually taking what is given to me through inspiration as a responsibility to give back to society through architecture. And again, you can see this sketch translating into a finished building. And then, of course, are the sketches that show how we were actually able to translate this into a finished building. Now, we're going to show you a 5-minute video.
Its design will draw inspiration from the magnificent landscapes of this region, but also from its architecture, construction techniques, materials, and decorative traditions, the center will attempt to reflect lessons from structures, both monumental and mundane, from spaces, both religious and social. It is my prayer that once it has been built, the Ismaili Center in Dushanbe will be a place of order, of peace, of hope, of humility, and of brotherhood, radiating those thoughts and attitudes which unite us in the search for a better life.
Now I'm proud to say, I was always proud, but now I'm even more proud to say that we have that Jamaat Khana in Dushanbe, and going in there is completely amazing feeling. To step in that building and see the walls decorated in a way that is mine. It's part of my culture. The roof, the ceiling, it reminds Pamiri house, Badakhshani house. The bricks, it reminds of Samarkand and Bukhara, Tajik culture that is now outside of my country. We can't freely go and visit that place anymore. But that's part of our pride of Tajiks. It's part of our culture. No borders, no difference. It's the building that belongs to all Tajiks. I started saying that it is Ismaili Center, that it's mine, Badakhshani. Now I can say it's Tajik. It belongs to Tajikistan. It belongs to all citizens of Tajikistan. It carries the culture, traditions, architecture of all Tajiks. And at the same time, it has the sweetness of my Badakhshani house, which is so good. Makes me feel really proud. And then when we went inside the prayer hall, there was no words, just feelings, just emotions, just feelings. Remembered all my grands. Remembered my grandma crying when she said that she's proud that she lives in this time when this Jamaat Khana is built and it's open for us.
My name is Trevor Bodie. I'm a Vancouver-based architectural critic. It gives me enormous pleasure today to place a nomination and give my endorsement to the Dushanbe Ismaili Center, designed by Farouk Noormohamed of FNDA Architects of North Vancouver. Why do I make this nomination? Well, in my view, this is a standout creation, a standout building in this part of the world. I believe its consideration of its historic and urban context is exemplary. There was an enormous period of research by Farouk and his staff into the Timurid traditions and to Ismaili notions of public building and occupation. This knowledge informs the building inside and out. It is an amazing creation for its environmental ethos, the way it was built, how it was built, who built it. I think the notion of extending the concept of construction and design into that of a whole community engagement is precisely in the spirit of the Moriama Prize. And I cannot think of a better building designed by any architect in Canada to carry forth the good name of the Moriama Prize.
You have created a remarkable building that will enhance the cityscape of Dushanbe, just as it reflects and reinterprets the materials and colors and inspiring landscapes of other iconic buildings of the larger region.
All in all, this project is not only about a building. It is about community building. It is about getting people together. And how this building actually came together is not the genius of the architect.
I believe that this building will make people feel the same way for other hundreds of years.
Thank you both so very much for sharing with us your knowledge, your experience, and your expertise with us today. We're going to now spend some time going over some of the questions that we got from the audience. And there were lots. So again, please forgive us if we're not able to ask your question today. But just I have to ask, because even after I saw this video and we talked about the step house, and we saw how, Farouk, how you incorporated that into the design. And so I have to ask you, what's the story behind the step house? What is the tradition there?
The Pamiri house is a house that basically the Pamiris in that region actually live in those houses, and traditionally that house has actually been one that was always used by the people. One of the things that happened is about when the Russians actually came into the region and stopped having them having the Ismailis practice their faith. You know, they used these columns and they added the fifth column, which is basically creating the 5 to remind them of the Panchtan. And this reminder of the Panchtan is a secret expression that they actually had within the Jamaat itself, so where they were actually remembering our faith, practicing our faith, but it was an inward expression. Let me take this a little further. If we were to look at the Ismaili Center in Dushanbe, one of the things that we were asked to do when we were given the mandate to do it had to be an Ismaili Muslim Tajik building. So Tajik, Ismaili Muslim building. When we talk about all those things, Muslim building, not so much of a problem. There's lots of examples of Islamic architecture you can translate. Tajik, you can see, okay, fine, if you were smart enough to figure out the Tajik architecture actually resides in Uzbekistan, and you go and research it there and you learn about Tajik architecture. Ismaili, how do you do that? So the whole idea was that, you know, when we were asked to build this building, and I was trying to gather information about what would actually create this building that would be really special, Ismaili building, and I couldn't actually get anything. And I phoned a person by the name of Khadija Shaban in Pakistan, and I asked, somebody told me that she had visited Tajikistan, and since we were not able to fly because of the time frame and the difficulty of flying out there, we were doing all our research by trying to phone and get this information. And eventually she tells me that, well, the information, that there's not much in the architecture of Dushanbe, and it's really boring. So I said, Khadija, tell me more. And she said, well, you know, I said, did you travel around? She said, yeah, we went to these houses, and these are little modest houses, and they're called Pamiri houses. So tell me about these Pamiri houses. She said, well, these Pamiri houses have these 5 columns. And I said, wow, what do these 5 columns do? And she explained to me what I just explained. So I said, if you're putting an Ismaili center, what is it? Ismaili center is a place of permanence of Ismailis. We're no longer afraid of telling people who we are. So what if these 5 columns, instead of hiding in a house, actually came through the building, and they were to actually symbolically hold up the roof, which is the sky, and they are becoming part of the world Ismaili community. So that became the wow of the Ismaili Center, and really the idea of those 5 columns coming in from the Pamiri house.
And I guess this is what I was talking about when I was framing the architectural language. So an architect not just looks at the project, which is a program, but tries to dig into the context, the society, the culture, the traditions, to think about now how his assemblage or her assemblage is going to be more than what was just asked of from the clients, which is going to be timeless. So this building, Farouk, if it was to be experienced by a non-Ismaili, would still be an awe-inspiring, right? In the sense that they would begin to wonder and might be an entry into what Ismailis are all about.
Yes, yes. I think the Cape of Visitors book, it has got some really interesting comments from a lot of people that have visited.
Yes.
And if you ever visit, one should actually ask what the visitors book, the comments from the visitors are when they come through the building who are non-Ismailis.
You know, some of the questions that were coming up were, you know, with the quote, you said that our buildings, we shape our buildings and our buildings shape us. And I think even just by this one example, I'm starting to realize what you mean about how buildings can shape us. Would you like to elaborate, both of you, on some other projects that you've worked on and how those buildings have come to shape the environment that they're in?
Zamila, go first. I'm thinking. You're a professor, you can do them on the fly.
No, so my scale, as you know, is from the public space sort of installation, site specificity. And so even though I'm trained as an architect, but my interdisciplinary background now is inspiring me to create works of art or provocations, if you will, in the public space where we can start to really talk about identity, talk about issues of who we are as Muslim living in this time. And I go back to the slide that I presented, encounters. And that was the idea. That was right after 9/11, and all of us were struggling, and there was a lot of things that were happening. So I sort of used my background, my identity, but used it within the means of a space, where one would come and hear the sounds of the water and be in touch with the patterns of the Islamic art and the shadows, and create this sort of layering provocation as an experience, if you will, to talk about identity, to talk about time, to talk about the elements which connect us as humanity. So I think the context, so what you create as an artist also begins to change your thinking in many ways, just as a big piece of architecture would, right? So it's, I think as architects, artists, we are constantly challenging the issues of the time, the human issues of the time, and then how can we use our materials to kind of create some sort of conversation, if you will.
Okay, I think I can jump in and I can give you live examples of some of the things that have actually happened from my work. One of the first Jamaat Khanas that we actually designed was the Union Mill Jamaat Khana. Maybe you may have some viewers, some of your people that are in the audience, maybe using the Jamaat Khana. And this was a competition. We won the competition. There's an opening ceremony of the building. And I presented the ideas that I presented to you, the same elements that I did, Hazrat speech, etc., and situated that building with that language. And the language basically is something that an architect actually gives to his clients, his users. And then those users take them in and translate them into the way of their life experience, of their understanding of their faith, their understanding of who they are, and how they will actually interpret the building will transform them, and they will transform the building. So let me give you this very specific and interesting example. So we were doing tours of the Jamaat Khana, and one of the things that we were getting to do was to bring the people into the prayer hall, get them to sit down and see how they feel. And of course, there is conversation after this, and there was a young person that was in the audience, a teenager, and he asked me, you see these peaked ceiling, there's like a coffered ceiling with peaks in it, but you have got half one of these triangles cut into half in the front wall of the prayer hall. Mm-hmm. So what was the reason? So I'm thinking and I'm scratching my head and don't really have an answer. We've given the language to the user now, okay? User is now interpreting what he sees and looking at the building and using his life experience and his understanding of his faith, etc. So he said, I know what the answer is. I said, tell me. So he said, the answer is that the half is the zahir, the present, but the one behind that you're not showing is our search, is the batin. Now, this is the way architecture actually gives you language to understand. What you are actually feeling, what the way you think about yourself, about your life experience can be actually translated through architecture. So that's a live example. Another example that I could give you is that we were asked to do a really tiny little space in the Museum of Anthropology, designed by the great architect Arthur Erickson, and we were asked to design a space. So first thing I say to myself, if it has to have context, and I'm going to do this Muslim space, for the Asia Pacific Conference for the Muslim leaders. And I'm going to put this thing in this special building. So we translated all of the ideas of the building into this little tiny 500 square foot thing. And, you know, we added all those little elements that you saw in a really micro scale. What it did was that, you know, of course, after the conference, you know, a lot of people went through this, and the museum said that it's a really interesting installation, and we want to keep it as an exhibit. So it stayed in the museum as an exhibit for all non-Ismailis to also experience the space, because it had a lot of feeling, a lot of things that actually touched many people, and they felt that it would be a good museum piece. So you can see how architecture can influence people's thinking.
Absolutely. Wow. That's a great example. And I was also just thinking about even the health centers that you've helped to design, and how that might be changing the way that people think even about their own health, and taking it, you know, maybe more, putting more thought into it. Mm-hmm. Now, we're getting a lot of questions about symbols or symbolism in architecture. So we know that architecture has secular symbols, it has cultural symbols, but what makes Islamic architecture Islamic?
You want to go, Farouk?
Professor.
Oh God, I think symbols are part of us, and I think when you go to the to this whole notion of you know, what were some of those ideas that Islam Quran generated for us, so the oneness of Allah, right? So whether that oneness comes through materiality, through calligraphy. So I'll give you two examples. So if you look at you know, any of these monuments that I presented, so if you look at Alhambra, the idea of the symbol of Zahir and Batin through a geometrical pattern in tiling, which is tessellation, you can see multiple examples. So the form of the wall, the physicality of the wall is dematerialized through the use of that repetition of one motif again and again, changing its colors, changing its nuances. You can see that in the expression of the mashrabiyah, which is the screen. And of course, you know, there is a lot more to do with it, which is to do with the climate, the style of the interiority, where women couldn't see outside. And so there's a lot of culture, but that symbol, if you think about it, can really unravel this notion of symbolism in so many, many ways. But that's not to say that's just Islamic. I think it's also a tactic that an architect uses to really think about materials. So, you know, if you think about building as a sculptor may chisel a stone and create a work of art. But for an architect, most of the time it is the idea of an assemblage, you know, materials that come together as elements and creates like this wall. You know, within that wall, how you play with solid void, you know, the numbering of it, all of that is what then Farouk can pick up on that and start to talk about the symbols from there on. So it's the idea of making also can be there.
Yeah, let me just try and take a slightly different take on this. When we look at architecture, and we always tend to look at the form of the building first, and then the meaning. And one of the things that I want people to start thinking is that we should start also thinking about meaning as we experience architecture. You know, the art was created not because it was only Muslim, but it was a way to construct without beams and concrete, and we were able to span spaces. That's how the arch came into play, and so also the dome. But these have become symbols of Islamic architecture. Mm-hmm. But there are many Islamic buildings, they have no arch, they have no dome. And I say the Ismaili Center in Dushanbe, or the Ismaili Center in Toronto, or Ismaili Center in London, they're all strong Muslim buildings. And what is it that makes them special? What makes them building is actually what you breathe into them. What you breathe into. And I've been thinking about this whole conversation about people being tied up in their homes. Can they add layers of thinking in their homes? We used to live in a house, you know, before we moved into our present house, where we actually deliberately created these symbols for us to understand. Our kids were really young, and we wanted them to actually understand that it's not only happening outside in the Jamaat Khan, where they want them to understand. So we created these arrival, there was an entry courtyard with the sound of moving water. And then you enter into the house. We had a red door, and you enter, and it was a symbol that you're basically going through, and you're going into a place. And we had skylights. In the skylights, we had Allah written on it. And as the sun would come in, it would actually dance through this whole space. Now, this is something that you can bring into your own homes. You don't actually have to create the symbol, don't have to attach it. You have to breathe into it. Look at your own homes. If there's a light coming in, think about what the light actually means, the play of light and shadow, the remembrance of the Zahir and the Batin. The sound of moving water, sound of water is basically the sustenance of life. So essentially, if we try to take beyond what we are actually looking at on a day-to-day basis, I think this is the time when we are home. Take time to think and think about breathing a lot of life, an understanding of our faith into our homes. And you can then internalize all of the thinking that you've got from this presentation and see how you can actually apply it in your own life as you are now together in these separate situations with the COVID-19.
Thank you. Okay. I'm going to push for one more question, and then you guys can kind of answer how you would like. But I think that we kind of all want to know where the inspiration comes from when you guys work on your projects, whether those are exhibits or whether it's, like actually building buildings. Like, how do you even center yourself? How do you even, to even get to that next level?
Okay, I'll go first. Okay, this is a really, really interesting thing for me. And at the end of that presentation, you saw me speak. And I said, it's not the genius of the architect, okay? The great buildings are not genius of the architect. The genius is Allah. It's his inspiration and the openness of the heart of the architect that translates that to make it into a great building. So to me, architecture is like meditation. You sit and you hope that you will see light, okay? And you're not always lucky. You're not always lucky. And I'll give you one example. In fact, I had it in my presentation, and because of the time, I actually had removed it. And it was a competition for Jamaat Khana that we were doing in Edmonton. And when we start looking at buildings, trying to put together, a client gives you a program, and this program is basically, prayer hall will be so big, so many classrooms, and all these other elements. So architects is trying to put all these together. And when this is a struggle, you are thinking. When it's a struggle putting it together, you're thinking, and you're not getting anything from above, that help that is necessary. So we struggled and we struggled and we struggled, and we made the submission. And we did not win. But as luck would have it, nobody won. So they didn't like any of the submissions. The jury didn't like it. They basically said, okay, go back to the boards. And by this time, they were running competitions for a number of Jamaat Khanas, and there was a competition for a Jamaat Khana headquarters in Calgary. We'd won the competition, so we decided, I told my team, we're not doing it. And this is it. So I'm sitting in bed after we've told everybody in the office that we're not going to do this thing, flipping through the designs. And in fact, I had actually those designs that I was actually going to show you. I'm looking at this pattern, and I'm seeing the whole problem that we had in the Jamaat Khana we couldn't resolve was resolved in just looking at that. So it was an inspiration. It was an instant. At that moment, I saw the whole building. I sketched and I sketched and I sketched, and I was going to show you those sketches in the presentation that I actually removed. Those sketches actually then framed the thing. And when we submitted, I knew it was a winner because I didn't design it. That's that inspiration. That's that spark that you get to design. Zamila.
So I'll take a little bit of a different attitude to this, because I have to teach design and I have to inspire my students to think about, how are they going to set themselves up for success with any project, any design. So in my own work, I am always inspired by the issues that are around me, so the questions that one needs to ask. And I call ourselves not just as architects who serve our clients, but also as social agents of change. So I really, I teach courses in sort of this idea of tactical urbanism, where we ask the question, what is the society going through, right? And so there are issues of identity, there are issues of refugees, there are issues of wall, if you will, right? So these are all very pertinent questions of our time. So once, you know, there is a question, so this notion of refugees is a big question now, especially after our, you know, after our country wants to build a wall, right? And so if you take that into notion, you know, then, you know, we bring a team together, we brainstorm, and we try to understand the context within which we can now create a provocation at a slightly different scale to really get the conversations going. So then once we have a good question, then from that questions, we look at the process of architectural materials, if you will, you know, to create this sort of ideas, you know. And so for me, I think the question, framing the question is the most important thing. And then how I get to my answer is through a series of investigation, analysis, you know, within the context of where it will be, site specificity, materiality. And I think for me, it's very exciting to engage digital design and digital technology into the making of things. And so as we are going through the making, you know, and looking at different materials and light and digital world that is available to us, a sort of a composition happens, you know. So for me, it is, yes, of course, the inspiration, and then, you know, how we are framed and trained, you know, our backgrounds always play into it as undertone. But I cannot go into a project saying that, you know, as a Muslim, you know, I can do this. So I think there's a different way, operations, I would say, a methodology of arriving where we all need to arrive, which is creating something which is much larger than where we started, to inspire the spirit.
Thank you so much. And especially since they are timeless pieces, we do want to make sure that we are always inspiring the spirit when we think about these things. So thank you so much, Farouk and Zamila, for enlightening us and speaking to us about connecting the spirit through architecture. I also want to thank the audience for coming up with some amazing questions. You added a lot of value to the to the speaker series. And again, thank you all for joining us today, and wishing you all a wonderful Sunday. Thank you.